So welcome back to part 3 of Type in Illustrator. In this part of the video, we're going to go into detail about typesetting in Illustrator. I've cleared off my artboard and let's get into it. So here I've simply typed out the quick brown fox jumps over the lazy dog in the minion variable typeface. This should be pre-downloaded into your Adobe Illustrator. You can, however, use any typeface. I would recommend a serif just because you can see some of the differences a little bit better, but ultimately it doesn't matter what you use. The reason why I use this statement is because it uses every letter of the alphabet, which makes it commonly used for typography. Basically, in this section, what we're going to do is talk through the character and paragraph panels. You can find this panel up here, but also, like usual, you can find it on the sidebar. I'm just going to open the sidebar one because it'll be easier for this demo and for you to see everything. I selected a variable typeface because this is a somewhat new feature to Illustrator. A variable typeface allows you to interpolate between different weights or different styles. After clicking this icon, the variable font icon, this variable typeface allows you to interpolate between different weights and optical sizes. Optical sizes change the contrast between thick and thins to help legibility at different point sizes. For example, if I were to use this typeface for a billboard, I would have a lot more room to have details in the typeface. However, if I minimized it for 8-point copy for a book or something, when I print it out, a lot of those thin lines might just disappear. If I adjust the optical size, it will make a lot of those thins a bit thicker, which will make it more legible at a small size. Variable fonts are becoming more and more popular because of how customizable they are. If you have the chance, I definitely recommend you try using some of them and also check out some of the cool stuff that people are making with them. So I'm just going to actually undo all of this and go back to just a regular weight, just for simplicity, and we can move on to scaling type. So we discussed this a little bit earlier, but basically you can change the point size here with this first option, or while it's selected, hold Option and use the arrow keys to move up and down point sizes. So up next, this little VA symbol over here represents kerning. So kerning is basically adjusting the space between two letters in order to create a more proportional word. So if you click between any two letters, you will see that the kerning input usually already has a set number. The type designer already inputted these, knowing that these two letters look weird with their default spacing. We can adjust the kerning by using negative numbers to push letters closer together or positive numbers to push them further apart. You can also hold Option while using the left and right arrow keys to adjust the kerning. As a reminder, in order to adjust the kerning of two letters, you have to have your cursor in between them. I thought you might be wondering why you would ever need to use kerning, so here's an example. So I just typed out the word walk. If you look closely, you might notice that the space between the W and the A is actually a lot wider than the space between the A, L, and K. However, the space only feels wider because of this diagonal line on the W. If you actually look at the space between the edges of both letters, it's quite narrow. But our eyes don't work mathematically, they work optically. So in order for this word to feel like it's spaced evenly, we have to scoot the A over. So using our Option arrow keys, I'm just going to push the A over a little bit. Doesn't this look a lot more even and a lot more balanced? So usually when you use kerning, this will only be for like logo types, big title display type. Like you don't need to go in and kern your body copy for like a book. But when your type is big, you want to make sure that it is well kerned, or else other graphic designers will point and laugh at you. Okay, so up next is tracking. So tracking is kind of similar to kerning, only instead of just adjusting the space between two characters, you are actually adjusting all the spaces between all the characters that you've selected. You've probably seen this trick done a million times. Graphic designers love to use tracking, and you can also just select a single word within a line and just adjust the tracking between that as well. Cool. So the next thing we're going to talk about is leading, and for leading we're actually going to need a text box, and I'm going to make the type a little bit smaller. So instead of actually typing to fill this entire box, I'm going to right click and hit fill with placeholder text. This auto generates a few lines of lorem ipsum to fill up whatever text box you've created. So I actually just added a few more lines of text and made it a little bit smaller because while I was filming, I realized that it's easier to see these differences when there's a little bit more text. We're talking about leading, which is actually the space between each line of text. So while kerning focuses on the relationships between each letter in a word, leading focuses on the relationship between each line of text in a paragraph. A good rule of thumb for leading is usually to do around 1.5 of whatever your point size is. However, this doesn't always work for every single typeface, and it changes when you have different size text. Your leading can really determine whether or not your text is legible or not legible. When your leading is really tight, you'll see that some of the characters actually combine together. This obviously makes it really hard to read. So 1.5 of 11 point is just around 14 or 15. So around here, the leading makes it a lot more easy to read these lines of text just because there's enough space for you to find where you are in the lines, but not enough where you lose track of where you are. Okay, so next up, these two inputs allow you to change the vertical and horizontal scales of the words. Once again, my precautionary warning about stretching type, don't do it unless you know what you're doing, or someone's going to call you out on it. Next is baseline shift, and this literally just shifts the baseline of each letter. So I'm going to just select this K, and when I adjust the baseline, you'll see that I can move it above the baseline of all the other characters. This comes in handy every once in a while. Sometimes you can use these to make exponents. You just adjust the point size of the number, and then you can shift it up with the baseline. And it basically creates the look of having exponents. However, you might also know that when I selected this 2, there are a few different options, and these are open type options of different 2s that exist within this typeface. So if I create a regular 2 again that hasn't had my baseline shifted, there's this selection already that exists as sort of like an exponential 2. If you click this little arrow for like the more options over here, you can see all the different glyphs that the type designer created for you to use. So you don't necessarily always have to use the baseline shift. The proportions of the existing exponential 2 glyph look a lot better than the baseline shift one, but sometimes if you're using a typeface that does not have these existing glyphs designed, you'll have to use little tricks and tips to fake the missing glyphs. The next input is the rotation tool, which just does this. I've never found a use for this, but perhaps you can use it to make something cool. The next few things are pretty self-explanatory. Each one does something a little bit different. So if you select your type, the first one turns everything to all caps, just like that. The second one turns all the letters to small caps, so basically it turns all the lowercase letters into capital letters that are the same height as a lowercase letter or the X height. So if I take our walk and I overlap it with our small case letters, you can see that the lowercase a is about the same height as all of these small caps letters. So after that, the next two options are the subscript and the superscript. You can use these to make figures that are sort of like exponents as well. Next up, these last two options can make an underline and a strike through. These work really well for body copy, but I would recommend if you're creating a design with display text that is either strike through or underlined, to make your own line using the pen tool so you can really adjust the stroke width and the color and the space between the text and the line. You obviously don't have to do this. I just find that this always makes it look a little bit better because the default Illustrator line is consistent throughout all typefaces. So next up, we're going to be talking about the paragraph panel, which is located usually right next to the character panel. I'm just going to bring this out so you can see it a little bit better. But basically, the paragraph panel deals with alignment, justification, and other ways to tweak your paragraphs to look better. So the first option is the left indent, which pushes the left side of your text over. The option underneath that is the first line left indent, which only adjusts the first line of each paragraph. You can use this to set the indents at the beginning of a paragraph, or here I'm actually going to show you how I use this for bullets. So I push the first line indent all the way beyond the left indent, and then I'm going to go to type and then insert special character, symbols, and then bullet, which should look something like this. And then slowly you can adjust the spacing to make it look a little bit better and line up a little bit better. But essentially this is how you would set a proper bullet point. You never want the bullet point to actually line up with the left side of all the text. You want it to overhang a little bit, so this is a good trick for that. The right indent, on the other hand, does the same thing but on the right side. So you can break past the margins of the text box, or you could push it in and shrink down the width of the text. I've never found myself using this, but maybe you will find a use for it. The next two things, which are the space before and after a paragraph, are probably two of my favorite things you can do with paragraphs in Illustrator. So I'm just going to make a line break at this end of this sentence by hitting enter. It's considered improper typography to hit the enter button twice to make a space between paragraphs. So these options replace that, giving you more customization to the height of your spaces. Now, both of these technically do the same thing. However, I would recommend you use the space before a paragraph. And that's because when you have the space before a paragraph, the space only exists if there is a follow-up paragraph. If you use the space after, the space exists even if there isn't a paragraph that follows the first one. You protect yourself from potentially having sort of like weird leftover spaces. So the final thing on the paragraph panel is the hyphenate check mark, which allows you to turn on and off hyphenation. Now, hyphenation sometimes looks a little ugly when it breaks words up in a bad way, but hyphenation helps sort of the spacing and the overall look of the block of your text look a lot better. You will learn a lot more about this next year, so don't worry too much about it. Just turn it off if you don't like it and leave it on if you like it. So here, this half of this word, so Pat here, is left over on this line by itself. This is what we call a widow. There are a few different ways you can get rid of widows, and you do want to get rid of them because they're quite distracting. So like if this is your own writing, something you can do is just edit the text so it fits a little bit better. If you can't change the text, something you can do also is change the size of the text box. Now that might sound like a little bit too obvious, but sometimes even nudging things a tiny bit can make a really big difference. So let's just say both of those are not options. Another thing you can do is select maybe like the last part of a sentence or whole sentence and then adjust the tracking. So usually if you adjust the tracking just anywhere up to like 20 points, you can't really notice the difference. But if you do too much, you will be able to notice. So here you can see we squeeze everything a little bit together, but it doesn't really look like it's tighter than the rest of the text. This is a little bit more of a tiring way to do this, but you can also do this through adjusting the kerning. Say, for example, the tracking is too obvious and you can't get it all to squeeze. Sometimes nudging a few of, the kerning pairs will allow it to tighten up a little bit more without looking that much stranger. You will have to be careful if you do this. Like you can see now, things are really uneven. You'll have to go through and really spread it out evenly so then things don't look like they're completely wrecked. There are also times when the widow only needs like a tiny bit of space in order to fit in the line above. Sometimes you can just kern like 2 letters and it'll squeeze right up. But basically, whatever method you use, it's all fine as long as it looks pretty even and undetectable. Just try and get rid of your widows when you can. People will always point them out if you don't. I hope this wasn't too much information overload. I went pretty fast, but please take your time to learn these skills. It takes some time to develop your eye to see typographic errors, but over time you will see yourself noticing these details a lot easier. Please ask your TAs or other designers in the program if any of this stuff doesn't make sense to you. We will be moving on to some other stuff in the next video in this lesson, so please hop on over there when you've made sense of everything in this one.